No one expected what was about to happen when Chief Justice John Roberts tried to humiliate Karoline Leavitt with a crippling $50,000 fine meant to shut her up. But they had no idea what was coming next. Inside the hushed grand marble courtroom of the U.S. Supreme Court, cameras clicked, live feeds blazed across social media, and a nation held its breath. Senators leaned in, journalists whispered, and millions watched online as a high-stakes standoff unfolded, one that would test the limits of truth, power, and personal conviction. At the center of it all stood Karoline Leavitt, young, fierce, and unflinching. Once dismissed as just another media personality, she now found herself facing off against the most powerful judge in America. But this wasn't about ego. For Karoline, it was personal. Her voice had been silenced before. Not this time. Not again. Across from her sat Chief Justice John Roberts, cloaked in black, wielding centuries of legal precedent like a sword. His gavel wasn't just a symbol, it was a weapon. To him, Karoline represented chaos, populism, defiance. But beneath, his stern expression was a fear no one could see, that she might be right. The stakes? If Karoline bowed, it would send a message to every whistleblower, journalist, and outsider that truth had limits. But if she stood her ground, the entire court and country might never be the same. And the moment Karoline opened her mouth, the entire room shifted. The room felt colder the moment Chief Justice Roberts leaned forward, narrowing his gaze at Karoline Leavitt, as if she were a reckless child who'd wandered onto his sacred chessboard. "Ms. Leavitt," he began, voice smooth but laced with disdain, "you claim to be a defender of free speech, yet you've built your career on inflammatory rhetoric and half-truths. And now you're here crying censorship over a fine. Tell us, how exactly does that work in your mind?" Laughter rippled faintly through the gallery. Cameras zoomed in. Hashtags lit up screens. Leavitt on trial. Silence or speak. Roberts adjusted, his glasses pausing for effect. "You come into this chamber not as a legal scholar, not as a constitutional expert, but as a pundit, a provocateur. You've never argued a case, you've never written a law review, you've never even held elected office, and yet here you are challenging the integrity of the court. Why?" The implication was brutal. She didn't belong, Karoline. Didn't flinch. "Let me guess," Roberts continued, cocking an eyebrow. "This is all for a podcast clip, isn't it? A little viral moment for your followers." Now the tone turned condescending, almost cruel. "And let's not forget," he added, holding up a printout of her social media post, "this is the exact statement that earned you the $50,000 contempt citation. The Supreme Court has become a political playground where truth is gagged and justice is bought." He leaned back. "Enlighten us, Ms. Leavitt. How is that not defamation?" The courtroom was silent. It was the perfect trap. He had framed her as unserious, irresponsible, and undeserving of the platform she wielded. And with the fine already imposed, public perception was tilted in his favor. But Karoline didn't blink. She adjusted her blazer, glanced once at the cameras, then locked eyes with Roberts. Her voice was steady, calm, razor-sharp. "Your Honor, if my words sound inflammatory, it's only because the truth often is. But let's clarify something. This isn't about whether I've written a law review. This is about whether the law still protects dissent." Roberts narrowed his eyes. Karoline continued. "I was fined $50,000 not for inciting violence, not for spreading disinformation, but for stating my opinion, an opinion backed by precedent, data, and constitutional principle." She reached into her bag and held up a thin binder. This contains documented examples of contradictory rulings from this court over the past 5 years, 1 page per decision, Roe, Chevron, speech on college campuses. You've ruled one way, then flipped. Why political pressure, changing winds? And when people like me point that out, we're punished. There was a murmur in the gallery. "And by the way," she added, turning a page, "your own dissent in National Speech Coalition versus FCC states, quote, silencing unpopular voices is the first betrayal of democratic values. Those are your words, Chief Justice, so which is it? Do you believe in free speech or only when it suits the bench?" Boom! The crowd rustled. Even the stenographer paused, blinking. Roberts straightened his shoulders, clearly caught off guard. Karoline wasn't done. "You say I'm just a pundit," she said, voice rising. "But what am I really guilty of? Pointing out hypocrisy, asking why a man in robes thinks he can put a price tag on someone's opinion." She stepped toward the bench. "You may not like how I say it, but the First Amendment wasn't written to protect politeness. It was written to protect the truth when it's inconvenient." Now it was Roberts who was silent, and slowly, subtly, the energy in the room began to shift. A woman in the back, clearly a legal intern, nodded slowly. One of the justices leaned toward another, whispering with raised brows. Online, the comments exploded. She just used Roberts' own ruling against him. This girl is no joke. Karoline's cooking. And somewhere a clip of her quoting the Chief Justice's own dissent began going viral on X. Roberts picked up his gavel, but didn't strike it. He forced a smile. "Well argued," he said tightly, "but rhetoric won't save you, Ms. Leavitt. The fine stands, and this court does not exist to indulge your Twitter performances." Karoline smiled back. "That's where you're wrong, Your Honor. This court exists to defend the Constitution, even when it's inconvenient for those in power." The audience held its breath, but that was just the beginning. What happened next changed everything. Chief Justice Roberts wasn't done, not by a long shot. After Karoline Leavitt's sharp counterattack shook the courtroom's confidence, he leaned forward, steepling his fingers with the air of a man who had seen thousands of witnesses stumble and knew exactly where to push next. "Let's not play games, Ms. Leavitt," he said, a slight sneer curling at the corner of his mouth. "You've made a career out of weaponizing outrage, one soundbite at a time. You claim to stand for the people, but let's be honest, you've never lived like them." He gestured toward the gallery, his voice rising, suddenly performative. "You grew up in a politically connected New England household, attended private school, interned for a congressman before you could even drive legally, and now you sit here pretending to be some populist martyr for the working class. Spare us the—" Charade, the words hit like a slap. Murmurs rippled through the room. Then came the kill shot. "Let's talk about integrity," he continued, flipping through a printed dossier. "You once said, quote, 'We must hold elites accountable, even judges.' But in that same month, you dined at the Jefferson Club in D.C., the most exclusive, members-only establishment in the country. So tell me, Ms. Leavitt, were you holding the elites accountable from the wine cellar?" Laughter erupted in pockets of the audience. Some shook their heads. Others clapped slowly, sarcastically. The trap was obvious now. Paint her as a hypocrite, a fraud, a privileged outsider masquerading as a voice of the people. Even the court's media feed began running a chyron. Karoline's populism questioned, caught living elite life. Roberts leaned back, smug. "Well," he said, "would you like to tell the country how fighting the system from inside a 300-a-plate steakhouse really works?" Karoline stood still, not rattled, not shaken, but calm, unnervingly so. She took a slow breath, surveying the crowd. And then she spoke. "I was at that steakhouse," she said, "and I was seated at a back table, not for luxury, not for vanity, but because a Gold Star widow invited me there to discuss how her son died in Afghanistan, while the military brass who failed him got promoted." Silence. Karoline stepped forward. That woman had been calling elected officials for 5 months and got no response. Her story never made it to the front page. "I took that meeting because someone had to listen, and that's what you call elitism?" Now the silence turned into discomfort for Roberts. She pulled out her phone and held up a photo, not of herself but of a folded American flag clutched in the hands of the widow. Projected on the courtroom monitor, it silenced the final whispers. "That woman didn't care where we met," Karoline said. "She cared whether someone would speak her truth in a room of power." She turned her gaze back to the Chief Justice. "And you know what? I do come from privilege, not money, not politics, but from a family that taught me to never be afraid of bullies in high places." Gasps. Someone near the back actually clapped before covering their mouth. Karoline kept going. "You talk about my upbringing like it disqualifies me. But what disqualifies someone from telling the truth? You, a robe, a title? Is that how justice works now? Then she walked right up to the evidence table, picked up the printed copy of her tweet, the one that earned her the $50,000 fine, and held it up. "This cost me $50,000, she said, "because I dared to say this court has become politicized." Then she read it aloud again. "The Supreme Court has become a political playground where truth is gagged and justice is bought." Her eyes locked with Roberts. "And the fact that you fined me for saying that, instead of proving me wrong, tells me I was right." Boom, a low, shocked whoa escaped someone in the press gallery. The air was different now. Justice Eleanor Ward, seated 2 chairs from Roberts, raised, her eyebrows visibly impressed. The court reporter typed faster. The gallery was leaning forward, whispering, nudging each other. Outside the courtroom, the internet exploded. Karoline just flipped the elite narrative on its head. She destroyed Roberts' hypocrisy line. Roberts weaponized her. Background, and she turned it into armor. And somewhere on Capitol Hill, a senator texted another. "You watching this Leavitt thing?" She's making Roberts sweat. But Karoline didn't gloat. She stood tall, composed. "This isn't about who dined where," she said. "It's about who is using power to silence speech and who's willing to pay the price to defend it." Roberts swallowed. And then, quietly, he reached for his water glass, a subtle but unmistakable tell. He was rattled, but he still had one more move to make, and the next move from Chief Justice Roberts would be his biggest mistake yet. Chief Justice. Roberts sat motionless, hands folded on the bench, but his eyes were calculating, one colder now. He'd underestimated Karoline Leavitt once. He wouldn't make that mistake again. He cleared his throat, his voice suddenly dry and deliberate. "Ms. Leavitt," he began, "since you're so confident in your understanding of the Constitution and the judiciary's role, I assume you won't mind answering a more technical question, live under oath and without notes." Karoline didn't flinch. "Go ahead." Roberts gave a tight smile. "Please explain how your tweet accusing the court of bias is not a direct violation of Caperton versus A.T. Massey Cole Co. And while you're at it, reconcile your stance with the precedent set in Garrison versus Louisiana regarding defamatory speech against public officials." The room tensed. Even Justice Eleanor Ward leaned back in her chair, blinking. The gallery murmured. Legal analysts exchanged stunned looks. He hadn't just asked her to explain one obscure ruling. He had invoked 2 landmark cases, known only to high-level constitutional scholars. One dealt with judicial bias, the other with the limits of protected speech when criticizing public officials. It was the kind of challenge designed to obliterate a political opponent. Even Karoline's own supporters in the gallery looked worried. Roberts tapped his gavel lightly. "Well, or should we pause so your lawyers can Google the answers?" Snickers from a few courtroom observers. A cameraman zoomed in on Karoline's face, hunting for the slightest crack in her composure. But Karoline didn't blink. She took one step forward, eyes steady, voice clear. "Caperton versus Massey," she began, "established that due process is violated when a judge's financial ties create a probability of bias. In that case, a Cole executive spent $3 million supporting a judge's campaign before that same judge ruled in his favor." The room went still. Karoline continued, "I didn't accuse any justice of accepting bribes. I raised a broader concern that repeated ideologically driven decisions combined with politically timed gag orders and selective fines are eroding public trust. That isn't defamation. That's accountability." She pivoted smoothly. "And as for Garrison versus Louisiana, that case ruled that false statements against public officials can be punished if made with actual malice. But the same ruling also reaffirmed that criticism of public officials, even if harsh or exaggerated, lies at the heart of protected speech." She paused, letting the silence settle in. "My statement wasn't malicious. It was based on a series of recent rulings that silenced whistleblowers and punished dissenters, all while shielding entrenched power. If pointing that out is a crime, then so is democracy." Boom. Gasps filled the courtroom. One law clerk dropped her pen. Even Justice Ward turned to Justice Breck and whispered something, eyes wide. Roberts shifted uncomfortably. His trap had not only failed, it had detonated in his face. Karoline leaned in, softly but firmly. Or do you believe Garrison only protects speech when it flatters those in robes? A man in the gallery stood up, clapping once before sitting back. Down, stunned at his own impulse, others followed. A slow murmur of applause built, awkward at first, then uncontainable. Reporters scrambled to tweet, "A to DC newsreel. Karoline Leavitt just schooled SCOTUS on Garrison and Caperton, without notes. This is not a hearing. It's a constitutional masterclass." Court Watcher 77. Roberts tried to trap her with 2 Supreme Court rulings. She used them to trap him. This isn't a legal defense. It's a political reckoning. Roberts' face turned pale. Karoline stood tall, unwavering. "And let me ask you, Chief Justice, if an unelected official can fine a private citizen $50,000 for expressing dissent, without citing clear malice or falsity, then what exactly separates this court from a monarchy in black robes?" The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. Dead. Silence. Even the marble walls seemed to hold their breath. For the first time, Chief Justice John Roberts had no response, and then Karoline reached into her folder, pulled out a single sheet and placed it on the evidence table. "Because if we're going to talk precedent," she said calmly, "then we should also discuss Bridges versus California, 1941, where the court ruled that criticism of the judiciary, even if severe, is constitutionally protected, unless it poses a clear and present danger." Her eyes scanned the room. "So I'll ask again, what was the danger? That I told the truth, or that you were afraid the public might agree with me?" Boom! Again. A collective gasp ran through the audience. Even the guards near the doors looked stunned. Justice Ward set down her pen, closed her notebook and whispered to a colleague, "She just turned this entire courtroom upside down." Outside, on TikTok, an excise civics teacher 90. Karoline Leavitt just cited Bridges, Garrison, and E. Caperton on her feet. Roberts brought a chessboard. She brought a flamethrower. Chief Justice Roberts gripped the edge of the bench as though it were the only thing anchoring him to the moment. His knuckles whitened. The confidence that once radiated from his posture had vanished. What remained was something colder, more fragile. Karoline's affidavit, and signed, stamped, and dropped like a grenade, still sat on the table before him. He hadn't touched it. He couldn't. The courtroom was silent, not out of respect, but out of shock. It was clear. The Chief Justice had been outmaneuvered, and the cameras were still rolling. Finally, Roberts leaned forward, clearing his throat, though his voice cracked slightly. "Ms. Leavitt," he began, forcing a composed tone, "you're not on trial here. This is a procedural hearing. Your dramatic flair may play well on social media, but it won't affect this court's ruling." Karoline didn't even blink, but "It already has," she replied, eyes locked on him. "Because you didn't just try to fine me, you tried to silence me, and now the American people are watching and asking why." A murmur swept through the gallery. Roberts pressed on, trying to regain the narrative. "Let's not pretend you're a martyr. You're a political operative with a platform. You chose to antagonize this institution." Karoline stepped forward, unshaken. "I didn't antagonize the court," she said. "I challenged its recent pattern of punishing dissent. There's a difference between disrespecting authority and defending democracy." Roberts raised a hand. Enough rhetoric. But his voice lacked authority. He was no longer commanding the room. He was grasping for control. Karoline turned toward the gallery. Not just the crowd, but the cameras, the millions watching live. "This is what power looks like when it's cornered," she said. "When the people they silence push back, they say it's drama. When we cite facts, they call it rhetoric. When we ask questions, they fine us." Roberts interrupted, louder this time. "This isn't a political stage?" "No," she said calmly, "but it's become a battlefield." And in that moment, something shifted. The illusion of judicial invincibility that Roberts had cloaked himself in began to fray. One of the junior justices, Breck, leaned to whisper something to Ward. She gave a subtle nod. In the gallery, reactions spread like wildfire. Our courtroom buzz. Karoline just said, "Power looks different when it's cornered," and the Chief Justice's face says it all. So truth spills. Roberts is stuttering, spinning, and stalling. This isn't a hearing anymore, it's an implosion. Even the court stenographer paused for a second, visibly shaken. Roberts tried to redirect. This fine was issued because your remarks had the potential to erode public confidence in the judiciary. Karoline raised an eyebrow. You mean the remarks that half the country already agreed with? The ones that went viral because they reflected public concern, not created it? She stepped even closer. Isn't it more dangerous for the court to punish public speech it doesn't like than to allow public frustration to be heard? Because last I checked, accountability is the backbone of legitimacy. Another ripple of applause. Louder now. A few claps turned into scattered standing ovations. Robert's voice dropped, quieter, more defensive. You are misrepresenting the intent of the fine. Karoline's voice didn't rise, but it gained gravity. No, I'm revealing it. She walked over to the affidavit on the table and tapped it once. If multiple federal judges believe your pattern of fines and gag orders has become political, then this isn't about me. It's about you, and about how far the highest court in the land is willing to go to crush criticism. Robert stood abruptly. A collective inhale swept through the courtroom. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he slowly removed his glasses and placed them on the bench. His hands trembled, not dramatically but just enough to betray his unraveling. I have served this court for 2 decades, he said, and I will not be lectured by a 20-something political commentator with a microphone and a Twitter following. Karoline smiled. Then perhaps it's time to ask why someone with 2 decades of service is afraid of a young woman with nothing but a microphone and a conscience. Boom! The courtroom erupted. Journalists dropped their jaws. One reporter from the Hill could be seen mouthing, "Oh my God." Twitter exploded, and viral law clips. Karoline just torched the Chief Justice with, "Why are you afraid of a young woman with a conscience?" This is a generational reckoning. Gen Z for liberty. Leavitt is what courage looks like. Calm, poised, surgical, and utterly unstoppable. Roberts sat down again, his voice now barely audible. We're adjourned. Until further review. But Karoline didn't let him off that easy. She raised her voice, not in anger, but in truth. No, Mr. Chief Justice, you're not adjourned. You're exposed. The words echoed through the marble halls like thunder. One of the junior justices, visibly rattled, rose from his seat and walked out the side door. Another gasp. Karoline turned back to the gallery. Her gaze scanned every corner. Her voice softened. I came here today expecting to be silenced, fined, shamed. I never imagined it would be the other way around. And as she spoke, a slow chant began to form from the crowd. Soft at first, then stronger. Let her speak. Let her speak. Let her speak. And Roberts, his composure shattered, his courtroom spiraling out of control, could do nothing to stop it. Cliffhanger. But the final moment of truth was still to come. The courtroom felt like it was teetering on the edge of chaos. The murmurs hadn't died down. Karoline Leavitt stood unshaken, a defiant figure in a navy blazer, the kind that screamed both youth and seriousness. The chant, "Let her speak," still echoed faintly in the marble chamber. But then, the Chief Justice stood again. This time his voice trembled with a cocktail of rage and desperation. Enough, he spat, louder than he intended. This entire spectacle is beneath the dignity of this court. You want to posture for your base? Fine, but don't confuse viral fame with truth. And don't mistake a trending hashtag for the weight of the Constitution. He laughed dryly, mockingly. You think you've done something profound here today, Ms. Leavitt? You haven't. You've grandstanded like a cable news pundit looking for a sponsorship deal. Karoline's face didn't flinch. He stepped closer, now abandoning the veil of judicial calm. This court doesn't answer. To your followers, your influencers, or your clickbait headlines, you can't intimidate us with retweets. Some in the audience shifted uncomfortably. That's when Roberts leaned on his last card. Emotional deflection. I've sacrificed my reputation to keep this institution neutral while both sides tear it apart, he said, voice rising with every syllable. You don't know what it's like to carry the responsibility of holding this country's fabric together while being vilified from every direction. You think you're the hero? You don't even understand the weight of the gavel you're criticizing." He paused, proud of his final words, certain they'd pierced something in her. But Karoline took a single step forward and spoke with chilling calm. "Justice Roberts." Her voice dropped, low, measured, cutting like a scalpel. "You just admitted it." The room froze. "What?" He asked, confused. "You said you sacrificed your reputation to keep the court neutral," she said. "But neutrality isn't supposed to be a performance. It's a principle, one that doesn't get traded for protection, and certainly not for power." She took another step, the courtroom camera turning slightly to follow her every move. "You fined me $50,000 because I questioned your silence on judicial overreach, because I demanded transparency, and now with cameras rolling you've exposed your real motive. You weren't protecting the court's neutrality, you were protecting its illusion." Gasps echoed. One juror's mouth dropped. Karoline continued, "You mocked me for using my voice, for having followers, for not carrying the weight like you do. But that's exactly what terrifies you, isn't it? That someone without a robe can still speak truth, and people will listen." She paused, letting the moment breathe. "You're not afraid of losing the law, Mr. Chief Justice. You're afraid of losing control." Roberts opened his mouth, but no sound came out. And then, the mic drop. Karoline reached into her folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Not a speech, not a legal argument, a poll from a non-partisan source. She held it up. "This was taken just days after your fine. It shows that 72% of Americans believe the Supreme Court is no longer impartial. 72%, not because of me, but because of you." She turned the sheet toward the gallery and the cameras. "No fine can fix that. But truth? Truth can start the repair." And with that, she placed the poll on the judge's bench. Not forcefully, just deliberately. A bomb quietly armed. For a full 10 seconds, Roberts stood motionless. Then slowly, he sat back down, eyes cast downward. Silence, then a single clap, then two, and then the courtroom erupted. The audience stood. Applause thundered. Even one of the junior justices clapped before catching herself. Reporters were already tweeting, "Our Am News now. Leavitt just ended it. You're not afraid of losing the law. You're afraid of losing control." Instant classic. Jurors talk. Judge Roberts silenced, literally speechless. That moment will be studied in law schools for years. Truth riot. She held up a poll, not a protest sign. That's what broke him. Wow. Even the opposing attorney on the court's side stared blankly, unsure how to respond. Karoline turned one last time to face the cameras. "Power doesn't make you untouchable. Accountability makes you credible, and I will never pay a fine for demanding that." Boom! The applause still echoed like a thunderstorm caught in the marble rafters of the courtroom. But in the middle of it all, Chief Justice Roberts looked like a relic. His hands trembling slightly, eyes staring somewhere far beyond the oak bench, in front of him. For a moment it seemed like he might retaliate, issue another order, demand control, assert dominance one last time. Instead, he reached for the gavel again, but not to strike it. He set it down gently and stood. Without saying a word, without acknowledging Karoline, he stepped away from the bench, not toward her, not toward the press, but toward the private chambers behind him. The doors opened, closed, and just like that, and just like the most powerful judge in America walked away from his own ruling, the room, stunned into silence, absorbed the weight of what had just happened. Karoline didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply stepped forward, stood where he had just presided, and turned to the crowd, to the country. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Let's be very clear," she began. "This was never about $50,000. The room quieted completely. This was about whether one person, no matter how powerful, could punish someone for speaking uncomfortable truths. It was about whether the rules apply equally to all of us, or only when it's convenient for those in power." She scanned the room. Reporters, clerks, young aides, ordinary Americans, eyes locked on her. "I stand here not as a former press secretary or candidate, but as a citizen. One of millions who believe that freedom of speech should not be treated like a privilege granted by the elite, but as a right guaranteed by sacrifice, preserved through courage. A quiet hum of agreement rolled through the audience. Karoline's voice softened. I grew up watching my dad wake up at 4 a.m. to plow snow off New Hampshire roads. My mom worked overtime shifts at the hospital during COVID. Neither of them had degrees from Harvard, but they taught me what most institutions have forgotten, that dignity doesn't come from a title. It comes from standing firm in what's right. She let that hang in the air. Then came the line that would go viral across TikTok, YouTube, and Twitter. In the end, intelligence, merit, and truth always rise above arrogance and manipulation. Gasps, a swell of spontaneous applause. Hashtags were already trending. Karoline crushed it, showed gavel down, truth wins, we're the court now. But Karoline wasn't finished. Look, I don't expect every person to agree with me, but I demand the right to speak without being silenced by a price tag. If the courts become tools of intimidation, then justice becomes just another form of censorship. She looked directly into the lens of the courtroom livestream, now being rebroadcast live on multiple platforms. And if you're watching this right now, if you've ever felt like your voice doesn't matter because you don't wear a robe, hold a title or have a trust fund, you are not alone, and you are not powerless. She placed her hand over her heart. Because truth is louder than silence. Cut to black. But the caption appears immediately on screen. Do you think justice was served today, or was it long overdue? Tell us in the comments. Share this video if you believe it's time we hold even the highest seats of power accountable. Stand with Karoline. Truth over titles. 50K silence fail.